Alright, my salmon's still cooking, the sauce is reducing, so we'll continue on and talk about adaptive radiation. Adaptive radiation is the idea that when a original colonizing population heads out into different places, it will adapt to each local environment, and you'll see changes. But at the same time, you'll see common features. So basically, common ancestors had potential for a lot of variation. And modern species are the products of thousands and millions of years of natural selection and adaptation based on the genes carried by the ancestral populations. When a common ancestor moves into new environments, we see colonization of multiple different environments, obviously. And these different environments have their own local environmental conditions. And our different populations of the same species will begin to adapt to the conditions of their local environment. And this will give rise to physiological differences. And different traits help in different places or conditions. And these will produce, you'll see physiological differences because different traits help in different places or conditions. For instance, our Russian desmon, the aquatic mole with its long, flattened, naked tail. A regular mole does not have a tail that's flattened like that. Because a flattened tail like this is great for paddling in water. A regular mole has just a standard circular tubular tail. So you'll see different traits based on the adaptations to different environments. And you'll eventually see different species with shared traits from the common ancestor. So let's say mammals. We have a mammal common ancestor that spreads across the globe, and it colonizes new environments. And over millions of years, the populations in any given environment start evolving and adapting to their local population, to their local environment, and you start to see different species. What evidence shows that all the mammals of today are radiated out from common ancestors? Well, every single mammal has a 4-chambered heart, internal fertilization, where babies develop in a womb or uterus, so there's no external egg, like reptiles and birds. All mammals have hair and fur, and all mammals have mammary glands for nursing their young, secreting milk. So from me to a mouse to a ferret to a whale to a dog to the Russian desmon, we all have these common traits. And these are evidence of common ancestors that radiated out into different environments, producing different adaptations to those environments.
You're already there, but you didn't keep it in mind.
So they became drastically different by adapting to their local conditions. But these shared features show that they radiated from common ancestors. So basically what it's saying is if you have a species that moves to a new area and there are unoccupied niches, remember, in little local environments, unoccupied spots for an animal to exploit, a species will adapt to that available niche. So let's look at adaptive radiation in dinosaurs, right? Many dinosaurs had feathers. If they evolved from a feathered common ancestor and radiated to new environments and new rules, we might still expect to see feathers in these dinosaurs. Well, let's take a look at some pictures based on fossil discoveries within the last 5-10 years. And these are artist renderings of fossils that were surrounded by feather imprints. So, 160 million years ago, we saw a dinosaur that looked a bit like this. We see these primitive feathers that are more of spines, hollow spines. They share a similar structure to the core of a feather, and with a little bit of the little tendrils coming off of them to make them interesting. Very primitive feather. 10 million years later, we see these. organisms here. And we're starting to see interesting traits coming on. We see more advanced feathering, even though these two dinosaurs obviously share very different role or have very different roles in their environments. So I believe my reduction is about done. I'm going to pull it from heat. And it looks like it cooked for around 25 minutes. Anyway, 130 million years ago, we have these dinosaurs. So 150 million years ago is when we see these wings here for the first time. And then 20 million years later, we're seeing more winged dinosaurs sharing similar features. Here's another one with wings and an advanced tail. And here's a really, really cool one. This guy with wings, flight feathers on all four limbs. That's pretty freaky right there. This is a great example of adaptive radiation. A new trait arises, feathers that are good for wings that help propel on air. And you start seeing lots of different variations on these based on their adaptations. 120 million years ago, we see this guy. And this is Sinosauropteryx. I include him because, well, as you can see, he's not one of these winged dinosaurs. He might be more related to this guy from 150 million years ago, or originally these guys from 160 million years ago. Sinosauropteryx is notable because the imprints of the feathers actually left behind pigment. We actually still found pigmentation molecules in the feather imprints, so we know the color of those feathers. So that's an artist rendering of the total feather arrangement, but that is accurate coloration, which is pretty awesome. 50 to 70 million years ago. All right, let's get into some dinosaurs that you guys know and love. Her? Right? Clever girl. The Velociraptor from Jurassic Park. Ooh, scary monster. Yeah, this is not what she looked like, though. This is what she looked like. We found feather impressions showing that the Velociraptor was a very, very well-feathered dinosaur. It had these long primary feathers coming off of its arms. It had a long feathered tail, feathers all over the place. Very elegant-looking dinosaur. So when that kid at the beginning of Jurassic Park said, "It's not scary, it looks like a big turkey," oh man, was he ever right. All those dinosaurs shared a common ancestor. And so adaptive radiation produced many different species with different adaptations to their local environments. But we can still trace those common ancestry in part through those feathers. Which of all those dinosaurs are closest to modern birds? The one from 150 million years ago. I personally might have thought maybe one of these guys here, because they've had 20 million years of evolution beyond the first appearance of this species. But, in fact, modern birds are more closely related to this Archaeopteryx here than these new and interesting species of feathered flying dinosaurs. So these feathered flying dinosaurs did not give rise to modern birds. These are not ancestors of modern birds. Well, I mean, obviously they're common ancestors, but they're not a close common ancestor. It's the lineage shared between modern birds and Archaeopteryx that gave rise to modern birds. So that's pretty cool. All right. So this dinosaur had sharp teeth, a long bony tail, traits common to dinosaurs, but it also had a wishbone, seen in birds, and it had feathers, especially those primary feathers on the arms that probably helped with gliding, if not flying. Let's take a look at adaptive radiation in Galapagos finches. Darwin proposed that Galapagos finches are descended from mainland finches, and that changes in beak shape and size are due to their specific environments and what they eat. So when you take a look at these finches and what they eat, you find some pretty interesting things. These fruit-eating finches have a large parrot-like bill. And those are good for digging into fruits. Then we have all these insect eaters, and they eat different sized insects. And the larger and tougher the insects, the larger and broader the beak. So this large insectivorous tree finch that eats large insects has a big, broad beak, whereas the small insectivorous tree finch has a smaller beak, but it's still broad. Then we get to the woodpecker finch, which is sort of interesting. It has what we call a probing bill, which is useful for getting under tree bark to get at insects there. So the warbler finch and the woodpecker finch both get under tree bark, and we can see their beaks are supremely adapted for poking into stuff and getting under things. Here's the cactus-eating finch with a sort of a sharp bill for poking into things that's broad for chewing on the tough flesh of cactus. And then we have bills that are used for crushing seeds. You can see these bills vary between big, large, broad bills that are great for crushing huge, tough seeds, and these smaller, more delicate bills. And all these finches share common ancestry with mainland finches. But these differences in bill size and shape are due to what they eat. So we can see when the mainland finch arrived, it occupied different niches based on food source, fruit, insects, cactus, seeds, and based on the specific kind of food that it took. So here we have the grasping bill for large insectivorous and small insectivorous, and then the probing bills for the warbler and woodpecker for getting under tree bark and grabbing insects. And the probing bill for the cactus eater that's still broad for getting through the flesh. I went through all this. Anyway, you see this nice adaptive radiation. So we see all these adaptations accruing in each species. And the question becomes, how do you get from one species to another? Speciation is the term for when one species becomes another. And it's produced through natural selection by evolution by natural selection and adaptive radiation. Basically, a common ancestor goes into new environments, adaptive radiation occurs, and it fills different environmental roles and different traits develop. And then different species develop. The question people always ask is, how does one species transition into another? And the answer is reproductive isolation. Reproductive isolation is a pretty cool mechanic, and it separates one species from another. Species is a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. That is the definition of a species. That's all. Group of organisms, they can mate with each other and have offspring that can mate with each other. That is the basic definition of a species. There's not some, iron wall between different looking animals. So how do you become a new species? Well, you require reproductive isolation, which means you don't breed with other populations. And you can be separate species even if you can have fertile offspring with a member of a different species. You can have this group of organisms here that can interbreed and have fertile offspring, and they're species A. And this group of organisms here that interbreeds and has fertile offspring, and this is species B. And if you, in the laboratory, forced species A and species B to have offspring, they would have fertile offspring. So how come species A is its own species and species B is its own species? The answer is reproductive isolation. They don't breed with each other. Species A and species B don't mix in the wild. Even though they can, they don't. Great example of this is seabirds. There's a variety of seabirds on the west coast. I can't remember their specific names, but there's something like 17 different described species. And scientists, when looking at these seabirds, noticed that the idea of the species is sort of wuzzy, meaning that it's very blurry between these seabirds, because a single species will basically have its own particular patterns on its coat, on its feathers, and it will occupy nest sites in different areas on the coast. And what scientists find is that when environmental conditions make one nest site better than another, the birds are perfectly willing to interbreed with the species that has the nice nest site. They're not going to bother with the fact that, oh, you have 5 spots on your neck and I have 7. I'm the 7-spot seabird and you're the 5-spot. We're a separate species. We can't breed. No, they'll interbreed and have fertile offspring. So the idea of the species is a very blurry concept. There's no nice, clean definitions between closely related species. You can get isolated reproduction through habitat, through timing of breeding, through behavioral approaches to breeding. So habitat. 2 animals that can successfully interbreed live in different places, and thus they're different species. Some stickleback fish live in freshwater, some live in saltwater and breed in freshwater. But their breeding grounds aren't nearby each other, so they don't interbreed. Even though in the lab, these stickleback fish can have fertile offspring. The saltwater sticklebacks and the freshwater, if you induce them to breeding in the lab, they'll have fertile offspring because they don't mate with each other. Because they don't mate with each other in the wild, they're reproductively isolated and they're separate species. They don't live and breed in the same places. So they don't breed with each other, so they're separate species. Even though they're not isolated biologically. Timing. Fowler's toads and American toads. Here's a Fowler's toad, and here's an American toad. They have some pretty different appearances, right? Well, they live in the same habitat. And in the lab, you can induce these toads to breed, and they'll have fertile offspring. But American toads here, they mate in early summer. And Fowler's toads mate in late summer. And so they don't mate with each other. They don't interbreed. So they're different species. Even though they look different, they could breed and have fertile offspring, but their mating cycles, the timing doesn't work. So they never breed with each other. So they're different species. And then isolation through behavior. In Darwin's finches, all 14 different Galapagos fish species can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. And depending on environmental conditions, sometimes different beaks and therefore different species are more advantageous than others. For instance, in a heavy drought, the big, large, heavy seeds are going to last longer. And so the beaks that are adapted towards being able to break open the large, long-lasting, heavy seeds are going to be well adapted in those heavy droughts. And those birds will have an advantage. So if conditions suck, and one finch is doing well, why don't the 13 other species come on in and say, hey man, you got a nice beak. Why don't you give that to my kids? The reason is birdsong. This is behavioral isolation. All those different finches have different songs. And when a baby hears mom and dad sing, it imprints on that song. And it only mates with others who sing the same song. So because those 13 other species don't sing a song similar to the finch who's doing really well, they won't mate with him, even though they could. Biologically, they're not separated. So oftentimes, speciation will occur through multiple kinds of reproductive isolation. And over time, isolated populations may develop genetic barriers to hybridization. So in general, the more amount of time between the speciation event that occurred, the more likely you are to have genetic barriers to hybridization. So The Fowler's toad and the American toad evolved recently enough from a recent enough common ancestor that they can still interbreed freely. But over time, simple genetic mutations can cause barriers. The most common barrier to two different organisms breeding and having fertile offspring is a different number of chromosomes. And that can happen through a simple mutation that causes one chromosome to break into two chromosomes, or two chromosomes to fuse into one. And suddenly you've changed the number of chromosomes, and now those organisms can't interbreed. So add lots of different environments, lots of time. Life has been around on Earth for billions of years, lots of mating and lots of variation, and you can get lots of different species with drastic amounts of genetic differences. So it is not at all unlikely for a rhino and an elephant to be related. You just add time, adaptation, mating barriers, and variation. So, what else drives evolution? Well, sexual selection is a driver of evolution. This is an extremely powerful selective pressure because in order to breed and have reproductive success, you kind of got to have sex. Sexual selection is the selection for ability to acquire a mate. Sexual selection acts differently depending on the sex of the organism. In males, sexual selection tends to select for males that can outcompete other males for access to females. So you'll see a lot of different species, especially in mammals. Males compete with each other for access to females, and so they'll be selected for the male that can compete best for females, because males don't need to be choosy about females. Male gametes are cheap. The energy required to make a single sperm is very, very low. Compare the size of a sperm and the size of an egg. It's like comparing the head of a pin and an orange. Which one do you think might cost less energy to make? A sperm. So sperm are dirt cheap, and thus men make tons, and we make them from maturity, from sexual maturity, on to death. Only death stops us from making more sperm. And so the best strategy for a male mammal is to mate with as many females as possible in any mating season. You don't care how fit that female is because your gametes are cheap. Spread them around. Females, however, are more likely to be choosy. Because a female egg is expensive, right? Head of a pin versus an orange. The female egg not only contains genetic information, but it contains all of the stored up energy for the first few divisions, the organelles, the cytoplasmic organelles. It's huge compared to a sperm. Eggs are costly. And thus a female only makes a certain amount before her reproductive years end. And so, in mammals, a female needs to be choosy about the male she picks to mate with. So, you'll see females selecting for traits in males that represent their fitness, their physical fitness, or their evolutionary fitness. Whereas males will just try and mate with every female they can. They don't select for fitness. So sexual selection can be pretty crazy. For instance, peacocks. Good old peacock. The male peacock has that giant fan of feathers on his tail. And when he's feeling sexy, he lifts that up and he spreads them all out. And he's got this giant fan of feathers, brightly colored blues and greens, and very, very obvious. And the male peacock has a big blue throat. He's a very pretty bird. But he also kind of stands out pretty well in his jungle environment. That is not good camouflage. nor is a long, long tail, because of that big fan, very good in getting around in the jungle undergrowth. In fact, you might say that a peacock tail has a negative impact on survivability. So why would male peacocks have this giant fan? Well, one of the ideas about the fan is that females use the fan to decide whether or not a male is very fit. You see, a male who's fit will have a nice big healthy fan, and he'll be alive, right? If he can have a big obvious cumbersome fan that's a negative impact to his survivability, and he's alive, then he's probably pretty fit. He's probably well adapted to his environment and a good choice. So sexual selection can oftentimes be more powerful than survivability. This is a non-tested thing, but it's kind of neat looking up monogamous species. For instance, eagles and a lot of birds, parrots. 90% of bird species are socially monogamous. But how does that square with male sexual selection pressures, right? Males want to mate with as many females as possible. Why would a male stick with a single female? Well, if your offspring have slow maturation rates, then they're vulnerable longer. And so the males might have a hand in raising the offspring. If the offspring are relatively helpless, having a male around to help raise the offspring and protect it is useful. Successful raising of offspring requires large investments of energy when you have slow maturing, helpless offspring. And so if both organisms are there, if both the male and the female are present, caring for it, you divide up the energy and increase the chances of successfully raising the offspring to adulthood. All bird species, however, engage in extra pair copulations. So what's interesting about birds is that they will step out on each other. So even though you have these pressures for monogamy, that sexual selective pressure on males still holds out, and male birds will breed with as many females as they possibly can. They'll just kind of do it when the female's away. And honestly, the female birds do it as well. They'll seek out more fit males while the male is away and breed with them. So both sexes step out on each other, searching for birds that have high fitness. So I think I just mentioned all this. In females, sexual selection drives mate choice because eggs cost energy and females produce a limited number, and when she runs low or out, she becomes infertile. So her best choice is to make sure the limited offspring she has are going to survive and reproduce. Thus, females select for mates with greater evolutionary fitness, greater mate fitness, better chances of your offspring surviving and reproducing. We'll come back talking about mutation.